Hey YouTube, welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video with Mr. Terry. So I continue my quest for historical knowledge here on the internet. Alright, today's video is 10 myths you still believe about World War II by, I think it's called All Time 10's. This seems to be a really popular video. I think when I just checked here, it was 1.7 million views. And people love top 10's, right? I'm a sucker for them too. Everyone loves lists. I don't know if it's just the categorization and then always trying to rank things. People always have an opinion about those sort of things. But I thought this would be a lot of fun to check out because there's plenty of myths in history, right? I'm interested to know what they are putting as myths. And we'll see if we can talk about those as they go. If you like the original video, go down below and give them a like and subscribe over there if you liked it. If you like what we're doing here and you want to follow along with me, love to have you as a subscriber as well. Enable those notifications if you want to know when live streams and live premieres happen. All right, let's jump in. 10 myths you still believe about World War II. We'll see. Do you believe these? Or did you believe these too, I guess we should say. All right, let's check this out.
10 myths you still believe about World War II.
What we got?
Number 10. Nukes ended the war. Accepted wisdom is that the war concluded...
Let's think about these first, and then we'll do it. Nukes ended the war. I mean, the war in the Pacific, because the treaty is going to happen a few days later. Okay, let's see where they're going with this. I mean, obviously it didn't end in the West. The war was over in Europe before the atomic bombs were used in Japan.
With Hiroshima and Nagasaki, prompting the Japanese Empire to surrender in fear of future nuclear annihilation. But as with all things historical, it's not quite so simple.
Now, just to hypothesize, one thing that people definitely put out is the threat of Russia in their invasion, because the plan was that, of course, after the European war was over, that Russia, as well as the Americans and other allies, would then turn to Japan. So I know that's a thing that maybe it's not solely one thing, like atomic bombs, but now on the eve of Russia basically declaring war on Japan, that had motivation too. I wonder if that's where they're going with this. Let's see.
Some historians have argued that while those bombings were historic for their individual destructive potential, consistent air raids on Japan in 1945 had already killed 200,000 people and pushed the country close to breaking point.
People forget this. The firebombing that was devastating before the atomic bombs were used and ready, of bombing a lot of these cities that had, again, a lot of wood structures and just set ablaze some of these Japanese cities that predated that. And of course, with the atomic bombs, it becomes so much more prevalent that people remember that. But a lot of people forget the bombing raids before that.
That's in addition to the fact that the Soviet Union entered the conflict just hours before the Nagasaki strike. That invasion defeated Japan's prestigious Kwantung army and left the country in a vulnerable spot.
This is one of the classic things for people that are a little bit more reluctant to say that the atomic bombs were justified, was that you saw there that Russia had just technically declared war on Japan a few hours before. So would that have led, simply within a few days maybe, or something like that, the Japanese to surrender? That they never really had the chance of a true threat of Russia entering the war being a part of that. Even before maybe an actual physical invasion happened. Because, of course, people, they say about the atomic bomb is that it was justified based on the fact that it avoided some of the hand-to-hand combat, or, sorry, the head-to-head combat that would, of course, lead to an incredible amount of lives with an actual invasion of Japan. But was there enough time, I guess, to process, or give, I guess, a chance, if you want to call it that, for Japan to really think about this, right? Now that Japan or Russia had just barely declared war, or were the Americans too quick to act upon that? That's a classic debate that is very common.
It's argued that this move had a much greater impact on the decision to call it quits, since surrendering to the US was preferable to allowing Stalin to violently remove the emperor. Number 9.
So that's true. I didn't think about that perspective. With the Japanese going, oh my God, like Stalin, if we're going to get invaded by somebody or have somebody oversee us, yeah, maybe it'd be better to be the Americans than, a maniac like Stalin. That would make sense. But again, they only had hours before the bomb was used to really even consider that, I guess.
Hitler's Iron Fist. On top of being pure evil, everyone remembers Hitler as the archetypical dictator who ruled both the public and the military to unwavering loyalty. But you might be a little bit off with the second one, since Hitler's military was actually pretty disobedient. Navy Grand Admiral Erich Raeder was said to have had hour-long shouting matches with the Führer in defiance of him, and there are even reports of naval officers having to drop their Nazi Party membership in order to sign up, since the Navy prized country over party. And that's not to mention Wilhelm Canaris, an admiral who leaked Axis secrets and used his position of authority to help plan the failed plot to assassinate Hitler in 1944. And not least of all, the army consistently ignored Hitler's order to stop absorbing so-called racially inferior Russian troops into German ranks.
I always think it's interesting. You hear about the attempted assassination plots against Hitler that had failed. Those are always kind of interesting, and when you study a bunch of them, you come to think that it would have been very possible, and that would not have been unlikely or surprising if that had actually gone through.
Eventually accepting 700,000 soldiers to fight for the Nazis by 1942. Number 8. It was a single worldwide conflict.
What does that mean, though? Hold on.
1942. Number 8. It was
what? I'll have to think about what they think of a single worldwide conflict, rather than a separate bunch. I mean, the thing, of course, you could bring up. A lot of people bring up is that how the Japanese invasion of China in the early and mid 30s should be much more closely tied to what people perceived as World War II. Right? A lot of people like to think it's just the invasion of Poland, right? But for years before that, the Japanese hadn't involved the both sides yet. But that's definitely something that doesn't get enough talk about, is the context of the Japan and China encounter in the big picture of what World War II is going to be.
Was a single worldwide conflict. There's a good chance that when you think of World War II, you imagine a consolidated campaign of good against evil between 1939 and 1945.
That's never the case in any war.
But when you dig a bit deeper, it wasn't just Axis versus Allies. It was a nebulous and messy cluster of individual conflicts. For one thing, historians don't even agree when the whole thing kicked off. Other than Poland in 1939, some point to the 1937 outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War, the 1935 Italian-Ethiopian conflict, or even as far...
That's another one people totally forget, is Italy's capture of Ethiopia. That's I think a fascinating story in the bigger picture, because decades before that, the Italians had failed to get Ethiopia before that. It's a classic thing about the age of the new imperialism, that everywhere in Africa got colonized by a foreign European power except for Ethiopia. They were able to defend themselves. And who did they defend themselves against? Italy, because they wanted control of some of that territory in the Red Sea. And then what Mussolini and them are doing is doing what the Italians had failed to do decades before with that. But people totally forget about that. That, in a way, might be the first act of aggression by the Axis powers, was the invasion of Ethiopia. It's also one of the things that people criticize heavily for the League of Nations, that were threatening sanctions and stuff, but actually did nothing when Italy did this. It was like the first thing that they failed to intervene on, long before, the Anschluss with Germany and Austria, and the take over Czechoslovakia, the Rhineland, and all these other things that were against the Treaty of Versailles.
Far back as the border skirmishes between Japan and the Soviet Union in 1932. And the Axis forces didn't even have the same goals. Mussolini supported Hitler's policies, but sought to bolster his own colonial goals in Ethiopia. And Japan didn't share Nazi social views despite its shift to the far right, even signing a non-aggression pact with the USSR while Germany was fighting it.
Stalin, he made a non-aggression pacts with all kinds of people, with Hitler. A lot of people don't know about the Japanese one either, so... He was trying to, be against the war for so many things and focus more on, I guess, the Soviet stuff that way. But we know what happens later. Those treaties end, and then they absolutely, the Soviets will invade and take other lands, after the war.
Even signing a non-aggression pact with the USSR while Germany was fighting it. Number 7. German mechanization.
Where are they going with this?
Nazi Germany has a reputation as a military juggernaut, with highly advanced divisions of tanks as the driving force of the war effort. But the reality of Hitler's army was that it was actually one of the least mechanized forces in the war. People often look at the Blitzkrieg capture of France to show Germany's military advancement, but 119 of the 135 divisions involved in the offensive used cavalry rather than armoured vehicles. Compare that to the UK, which was almost entirely mechanized by 1939. And often when Germany did...
Well, okay, so yeah, I mean, not everything was completely made obsolete. I mean, the horses were used even in World War I to a bigger extent than people thought. But we also know that Germany had to conserve resources too. That was the biggest thing that I guess a lot of people say held Germany back long term was the resources. You couldn't fully do oil production or petroleum powered or whatever machines because Germany was didn't have enough oil. It's one of the reasons they probably went down to places like Stalingrad and the Caucasus region because they had fuel. So you can't have everything be mechanized because there's not enough fuel to do that. So you're kind of forced to use, you know, cavalry if you need to, because you couldn't mechanize as much as maybe they're saying even if you wanted to.
Boast of a large mechanized force in battles, it would be made of seized French and Soviet tanks. So where did the mechanization myth come from? Well, Germany had an expert propaganda department, and it would make sure to over-exaggerate the few tank-heavy divisions it did possess in films, giving the impression that they represented the army at large. Sneaky. Number 6. The Axis could have won.
You know, I did a video reacting to the alternate history hubs thing about Germany could not win the war
at large. Sneaky. Number 6.
And I really did fall and support their thesis that Germany did not have the resources to make this victory possible. Not the victory that they looked like they were doing. They'd have to redefine what a victory looks like. If victory is taking over Russia, taking over all mainland Europe, then no, that was not possible. Did not have the resources to do that sort of thing. So I'm on the side of this that, yeah. And I don't know how many people really think the Axis could have won in general on the European front or the Pacific front. So I mean, I know there's some people that do for sure. I even had a poll on my channel that you could probably still see. It's probably still up. As could Germany have won the war?
The Axis could have won. Germany. People generally believe that World War II was a struggle down to the wire between Axis and Allied forces, to the point where the West could have all been speaking German now. But in truth, Germany's chances appeared to have been exaggerated as World War II legend grew. The historical consensus is that the Axis's failure wasn't a matter of if, but of when. The early capture of France gave many the impression that Germany was an unstoppable bulldozer through Europe.
Understandable.
But Blitzkrieg warfare merely functioned as a short-term tactical advantage rather than an effective strategy to defeat the Nazis' strongest adversaries, the UK, the USA, and the USSR. That's particularly true of the Soviets, who were outproducing the Nazis in terms of supplies and equipment to a point where they could never win a protracted assault. Hitler himself knew that a quick capture of Russia was his only chance, which clearly didn't happen. You could argue that had Germany succeeded in the Battle of Britain, less Western resistance could have led to a victory over Russia, but in 1942 it was likely game over. Number 5. In it together.
What do they mean?
For anyone who's not familiar, there's an idea that everyone in the UK put aside their considerable class differences to get through the war together. It wasn't uncommon to hear that people from all walks of life would gather in the tunnels of the London Underground to escape German V2 bombs over the city. But in reality, only around 70,000 of the city's 8 million residents hid in the tunnels, and they were mostly working class since wealthier people had their own bunkers. And on top of that, bombed buildings were regularly looted, and counterfeit, stolen and fraudulent ration books ran wild. But the British government knew that morale was key to the war effort, since keeping up supply lines was incredibly important to sustaining the army. So it pushed the narrative of togetherness despite considerable divides and resentment.
It has a narrative, though. The whole togetherness, it's a point of pride. I mean, it makes sense why the British would do that. It's like, you know, we come together in these times of crisis, right? Keep calm and carry on and that sort of thing. So that's spinning more of a patriotic narrative, I guess, than anything. I mean, everyone's going to be ever truly unified. FDR predicted Pearl Harbor. I wonder what we'll see by this, because there's definitely the criticism that there was intel beforehand that a attack on Pearl Harbor could be possible, not or an attack in general, like attack could be possible, didn't know exactly when or where. That's a criticism, but did FDR have some exclusive knowledge? Let's see.
Number 4, Franklin D. Roosevelt predicted Pearl Harbor. There's a popular and long-standing conspiracy theory that Franklin D. Roosevelt was fully aware of the impending Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, but refused to prevent it in order to create a pretext for entering the war. But
I bet this comes more retroactively, because you see a lot more of these criticisms of knowing in advance of potential attacks, but using them anyways as a way to encourage a war. It happened with like the Lusitania in World War I, that they were going into a zone they should have been doing, plus the Americans were smuggling stuff with Lusitania. Same with Gulf of Tonkin. And so it's happening with like the Vietnam War, it's happening with the Korean War, these incidences that get into the war that are criticized for not being handled the right way or intentionally misleading. But that's a different topic.
No matter how many documents are declassified...
So what he means is that since it happened in the future, people thought it was more likely that it happened in the past. Which is illogical, but...
Historians dismiss the idea as utter nonsense. According to Rob Citino of the National World War II Museum and FDR's biographer John Edward Smith, there was no evidence of any such correspondences passing through Washington.
I gotta be a pretty deep conspiracist.
In fact, FDR advocated crippling Japan through economic sanctions rather than warfare. Documents uncovered in 2011 did show suspicions over Japanese residents spying in Hawaii, but nothing predicted an attack on US soil. If anything, there was worry over US bases in the Philippines, but no one in the US believed Japan would be audacious enough to send a fighting force that far across the Pacific. Number 3, Churchill was a hero.
He's such a polarizing figure. People loved him or hated him. I mean, his own people hated him and loved him at different times. He was totally different. He's a totally polarizing figure. I mean, they didn't want him originally, and then bring him in when Chamberlain kind of fails to deal with Hitler. Bring him in, and then once the war's over, they boot out Churchill. Like, all right, thanks for winning us the war, but you're not the one that's going to give us peace. That seemed to be kind of the opinion.
Winston Churchill is fondly remembered as Britain's greatest Prime Minister and the hero behind its military victories. He was a great wartime leader, but many, even at the time, felt that he wasn't up to the job of, you know, actually being Prime Minister. In 1944, a Conservative Member of Parliament called Sir Cuthbert Headlam said never was a party so leaderless as the Conservative Party is today, in reference to Churchill's lack of domestic governance outside of the war effort. Not to mention that he was seen to have troubling views even for his time, like advocating chemical warfare, comparing Muslims to rabid dogs, and
are they going to talk about what happened with India and starvation, millions in India that happened?
Denying black people had been wronged by slavery. The most damning evidence is that as soon as the war ended, Churchill lost the 1945 election by a historic landslide, probably because he didn't have the policies to compete with Labour's National Health Service. Number 2, America won the war.
America, we won World War I. We won World War II. While everyone else in the background is screaming their heads off.
Common knowledge, especially if you're American, is that the US Army swept in to save a European military that was lagging in the face of German aggression. And while the USA's contribution to the war effort can't be understated, it would just be false to claim that they won it all. Exactly. That interpretation of the war...
I mean, the big thing they say is, would the Germans have lost without America? And most people would say yes, because the Soviets were already beating the Germans before America even joined up.
Grossly downplays the efforts of the USSR. For example, soldiers on the Western Front spent a combined 16.5 million months fighting, whereas Eastern Front soldiers spent 406 million between them. That's 25 times as long. Yeah,
you're going to piss off a lot of people. You're especially going to piss off the Russians. If you say that it was America that won the war, they're going to go ahead and show you a graveyard and see who paid the price, right? And who turned the tide of the war first.
And at 11 million casualties, the USSR suffered more deaths than the other combatant nations in Europe combined. Yeah. And that's not to mention Stalingrad, which is considered one of the bloodiest battles in history with nearly 2 million combined casualties. The Soviet victory proved a major demoralizing force for Hitler in the later years of the war. Number 1. Only the Axis committed war crimes.
Definitely a myth. Yep, let's see what they get into.
The prevailing view of World War II was that of the just, virtuous Allied soldiers versus the cruel, treacherous Axis.
Hey, we all know the victors get to write the story, right? And you can write it any way you want when you win, because there's no one to stop you.
After all, the Nazis were responsible for one of the greatest atrocities in history with the Holocaust. And while the Allied powers never even came close to genocide in the war, there were shameful moments that have gone largely overlooked. Despite being a matter of record, few people are aware of the US's actions during its Pacific occupation, where forces murdered thousands of Japanese soldiers who could have been taken prisoner, routinely mutilated dead Japanese soldiers by...
The accepted kind of belief is that POWs, you shouldn't kill. If people surrender, you do not kill them. You prison them. You don't prisoners of war. You don't execute. That is just seen as international kind of military expectations.
Stabbing their corpses with bayonets and decapitated them to use their mutilated dead Japanese soldiers by stabbing their corpses with bayonets and decapitated them to use their skulls as souvenirs. And women in Okinawa, Japan, claim that sexual abuse was widespread among US forces during the occupation. Some academic estimates suggest as many as 10,000 victims. And that's not to mention the Katyn massacre of 22,000 Polish nationals in 1940 by Soviet secret police, all of which is harrowing to say the least.
People are definitely going to cite some of those, the Russian atrocities in the East, because they get overshadowed. Yeah, for sure. That's probably where you're going to get the biggest grievance against this argument that it was only Axis powers.
That was 10 myths you still believe about World War II. Which one surprised you the most?
World War II
Let us know in the comments and make sure to like and subscribe.
Oh, come on.
And while you're at it,
like the Germans win, they defeat America and London, or just England.
Check out this great all-time 10's video on screen right now.
Okay. All right, everybody. What did you think? What did you think about these myths? Were these things that you had believed in? Fair enough. Do you think they are things that people actually believe in? Any thoughts on any of the things that they brought up, legitimacy of them, and some of the things that they kind of hypothesized? Feel free to get discussions going down. One of the best places to have discussions is in our Discord server. If you've not joined our Discord server, you definitely should. There'll be a link down below that you can join. We have over 4,000 people in there that have a lot of active historical knowledge and are very active and wanting to talk. So I'd love to have you over there if you have not. But yeah, I think we can get some discussions about this stuff, about the myths. A lot of these things I've definitely seen active on those message boards and Discord, so I'm sure you could jump into that for sure. All right, a few plugs just on the way out. If you like this video, give them a like and subscribe so you can see more stuff. I love these kind of videos, and it looks like maybe they do. This is my first time doing this channel, but looks like they do some other history stuff. Maybe we'll check that out if that's something you would that you would like to see. One other plug, if you would like to support this channel another way, you could become a Patreon member, starting at simply $1 a month to join. That supports the channel and also gets you involved in polls for videos that get featured on this channel. And that's a great way to have a little more say in this and be in a community and support our channel. But first and foremost, just thank you for being here and being a part of our community, and hopefully loving history as much as I do. All right, with that, we'll go ahead and end it here. See ya.